Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Curtis Brown Creative. If you're a budding crime writer, you'll be excited to hear that this week's sponsors are Curtis Brown Creative, the renowned writing school run by the major literary and talent agency.
Since launching in 2011, over 200 of their students have gone on to get major book deals, including critically acclaimed crime and thriller authors Jane Harper, Jenny Quintana, Laura Marshall and Alex Hay.
CBC run a wide range of courses covering a variety of topics and genres. Write a mystery worth solving on their 6-week online writing crime fiction course with award-winning author Vaseem Khan. Or learn how to pull off a jaw-dropping twist on their 6-week online writing a psychological thriller course with best-selling author Erin Kelly.
All online students are given opportunity to get feedback from one of CBC's expert editors.
If you're ready to learn new writing skills with an online course, there is an exclusive discount for Always Take Notes listeners. Use the code ATN20 for £20 off the full price of writing crime fiction or writing a psychological thriller or any other 4, 5 or 6-week online course. Visit www.curtisbrowncreative.co.uk to find out more. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak with the novelist Lee Child.
We spoke to Lee about starting the Jack Reacher franchise after losing his job in television, about film and TV adaptations from Tom Cruise and Amazon, and about handing the franchise over to his brother Andrew.
This episode was organised in collaboration with Theakston Old Peculiar Crime Festival. It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Lee, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for coming on Always Take Notes. We wanted to start off with handing the Jack Reacher franchise over to your brother Andrew. Interested in why you did this and kind of comparisons with other novelists like James Patterson who've done something similar, but also others who said they'd never do that. And perhaps in the context of the new novel with No Plan B, could you tell us about why you came to this decision and how it's worked, particularly during this handover period?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's great to be with you. And yeah, that is such a question. And it really comes down to a very rash promise that I made myself years and years ago when I actually started out in television. As a reader and a television viewer, as a younger person, especially as a kid and a teenager and so on, I just fell in love with series and authors and just loved that wonderful anticipation. You go to the library, you go to the bookshop and you find another volume by the same guy and you're just thrilled with anticipation. But I found that almost inevitably, almost without exception. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but the other case is far more familiar, where the author gives you 6 or 8 or 10 great books and then kind of falls off a cliff, clearly becomes lazy, runs out of gas, starts to phone it in. And as a reader, as a young person, I felt so betrayed by that I promised myself when I started writing on my own, I would never do that. I would never continue past a point where it became a chore or where I was running out of energy or where I thought that was likely to happen soon. And I was a little bit hair trigger about it, I guess, in that I did 24 books solo, and I think that nobody would say any of them are lazy or phoned in. But I just felt somewhere under the surface that this was going to come to an end. And I was okay with that. Everything comes to an end eventually. But the readers had invested so much emotion and love and interest in Jack Reacher that I felt they were going to be disappointed. I was going to let them down. And my whole ethos was never let the reader down. And so I thought, can we do an experiment? I mean, not exactly the same as James Patterson or anything like that, who basically runs an atelier or a workshop. He's a constant collaborator with a range of other writers. I thought, can we narrow the focus quite dramatically to find a person who was like I was 15 years ago, you know, when I was full of ideas and energy and stamina. And it started out just musing, really, just sort of theoretical. But then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, don't be stupid. There is a guy who is you 15 years ago. My younger brother. We share the DNA, we share the upbringing, we share the attitudes. We're a lot closer than any other collaborator could have been. So it became a kind of experiment. Could it be done? And I've been fascinated by that quite a lot in terms of, for instance, the Stieg Larsson Millennium trilogy was continued by David Lagerkrantz. And I remember being very interested in that at the time. How possible was it to get close to a very distinct character from another author? And I thought Lagerkrantz did a great job. I thought he got 95% of the way there. The 5% extra margin is just a kind of idiosyncratic madness in the author's mind. Can that be reproduced? And I think probably not, but Andrew stands a lot better chance of making it 98 or 99% because we are very similar people.
What was his reaction when you broached this collaboration or the idea of this collaboration with him?
I was dubious that he would take it on because he, you know, is a proud individual. He had 9 books of his own. He was doing a really interesting thing at the time. I thought he would be flattered, but ultimately say no. So I picked the time very carefully. We'd been to his own book launch in Denver, Colorado, and we were driving back up to where we live in Wyoming. And it was January, and therefore the winter is brutal. And we were driving through what they call a ground blizzard, which is where the snow is whipping horizontally in front of the car at maybe 60 miles an hour, and you have no idea where you are, and you're basically navigating by the GPS screen. You're driving along white knuckles and thinking, okay, left a little bit, right a little bit. And he was driving. And so I thought, this is the perfect time to introduce the concept because he won't react instantly because he's trying to keep us alive, basically. So I mentioned it. I said, I'm going to retire. Would you like to take over the franchise? And he just didn't really answer because he was desperately concentrating on the road. And then later, you know, the next day, he'd had time to think about it and come to a proper decision. He didn't instantly say yes or no. And he said yes, which surprised me a little bit, but it's been good fun, and I think it's working out pretty well so far.
I was very struck by your description of the ground blizzard in the piece on Wyoming that you sent over to us. It sounds a hostile meteorological phenomenon. But we wanted to come back to the latest books later in the conversation, but can we roll back now to some of your early life? I'm interested in reading again some of the pieces you sent about this stint in hospital, but also comments you've had elsewhere. A sense that it wasn't a fairly challenging upbringing that you had, but also that there was this figure who was a physics teacher who was an inspiration for you. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, my upbringing is in no way deprived. I'm not saying that we had an unfortunate childhood in comparison to anybody else at the time. We had leather shoes, we had 3 meals a day, we weren't abused in any way, but it was just an utterly cold and unexciting and repressed and boring upbringing to the point where I was just desperate to escape. I remember being 8 years old and miserable, depressed, just hating the way that I was being made to live. And I remember being on summer vacation and saying to myself, I'm 8, I've got to do this for another 10 years and then I can get out. And so it was a stunted life in terms of intellectual curiosity and emotion and so on and so forth. My parents are both dead now. Obviously, they died The last one died 6 years ago, but they lived their entire life without ever saying, I love you, to their children. And it was a sort of upbringing that it was in no way overtly bad, but it just forced us to try and escape. And I was happy to escape. I really have, enjoyed my life, and I was very happy to get out of it. But the writing thing, I went to a very accomplished secondary school, and we had English literature, obviously, and all that good stuff, languages and so on. But the physics teacher was the one that really inspired me to write in a way that was fluent and somewhat vernacular, but ultra precise, because we did practical experiments in physics. You heat this up and you measure it or whatever, and then you write up the practical experiment. And the idea was to do it exactly and precisely and with tremendous precision and clarity, but also brevity. And I somehow found that to be a great challenge, and I loved doing it. So really, the physics teacher, a guy called Ollie Matthews, he was the one that taught me to write rather than the English teacher.
And you went off to university and studied law, but you've said that you never really had any intention of becoming a lawyer. So what was it about that subject that appealed to you at that point?
Well, this was a long time ago, don't forget. I went to university in the early 70s, and students today have no idea what it was like. It was the exact opposite, basically, of what it is today. That only a small percentage went. I think when I was going, it was about 15% of the population. And if you were on a track like I was, having been at the school I'd been, it was absolutely inevitable that you would go to university, and absolutely inevitable that you would then get a job. That's just how it worked. And, I hate saying that to younger people because it is so radically different now. But that's how it was. And so it absolutely did not matter what subject you studied, unless, I suppose, you were super vocational and, wanted to be a doctor or something. Obviously, you got to take a medical degree. But the rest of it, you could do what you liked. And so I was just thinking, all right, I'm going to university. What do I want to study? And I was interested in a whole bunch of things: history, politics, language, economics, sociology, all that kind of stuff. And I suddenly realized that the law is a snapshot of all of those things at once. A law passed in whatever year, let's say 1933, a law passed in that year is the product of its politics, its economics, its sociology, and so on. So it seemed to me a kind of integrated approach to understanding society. And I loved it, and I absolutely recommend that to people. If you do not want to be a lawyer, take a law degree, because it illuminates so many things, and it also sets you up for life. You are out of date the day after you graduate because the law changes so much in detail. But in principle, you understand the way the world works, and it really helps.
Could you tell us about your pre-Jack Reacher career in television? But I was interested here particularly in your view of what some of those big shows that you were involved in, things like Brideshead and stuff in the 80s, Prime Suspect, how did they compare to the kind of current era of streaming TV that you've also had an involvement in through adaptations of your novels?
Well, I worked for Granada Television in Manchester in a kind of very arcane and mysterious job that was initially called a transmission controller, and then in order to disguise pay rises, it was promoted to a new name, presentation director, to make it look like the pay rises came from productivity rather than just union strength. And it was a kind of air traffic controller job of the network. This was all analog, it was all manual, it was all stopwatches in your hand. And the sequence of things that the viewer at home saw had to be seamless and smooth, and that was our job to put it together. And also deal, therefore, with technical problems, editorial problems, news flashes, things like that. And so we had central involvement with everything. I mean, literally our operation was called Central Control Room. And so we were involved with everything. And those shows that you mentioned, Brideshead Revisited in particular, was, I think, that was started in 1979. They started shooting and had it finished by 1981. And that was a very early, kind of 40-year ago, pre-echo of streaming television, because it was long. Well, it was as long as it needed to be, and it had infinite time and patience and space to just develop the story. And that brings us a lot closer to what we get now with streaming television. We went through a kind of middle period where, for an author like me, the only option was really feature films. And they're great, they're fun, they're, glamorous to be involved with. But fundamentally, you are deleting 90% of the work in order to compress it down into a reasonable running time of, say, somewhere between 90 minutes and 2 hours. And that is in itself an art form, and I'm not saying it's unsatisfactory, but from a novelist's point of view, you are getting rid of so much that it's a little frustrating. It's a completely different thing at the end of the process. Whereas a long-running time, like Brideshead Revisited was, like streaming television is now, you've got time, you've got space, you can have the quiet bits, you can have the slow bits. It's just so much more satisfactory. It's a recent thing, streaming television, and if it had been invented a long time ago, no author would ever sign up for a feature film, because the alternative is just so much more enticing.
And could you tell us about the circumstances that surrounded you being made redundant from Granada in the 1990s, and then how that propelled you into novel writing?
The situation was, toward the end of the 80s, Rupert Murdoch was setting up Sky Television, and of course the rumours were that he had a lot of influence over Margaret Thatcher and so on, and the Conservative Party, such that in order to gain a foothold for the new satellite service, they had to somehow damage the terrestrial services. And along with that, the Conservative instinct to defeat unions meant that we were forced into a situation initially 24-hour broadcasting. And the whole history of ITV had been about defending the hourly paid worker from management inefficiency, such that working late at night, and certainly working overnight, was massively penalized according to our agreements. And so when the 24-hour broadcast thing was rubbish in terms of content. I mean, there was nobody particularly wanted to watch it. The content was complete crap, and it was just a sort of Trojan horse in order to break down the traditional union agreement and introduce a new one. And tactically, Granada had a choice. Do they hire a separate night crew, or do they expand our working hours around the clock? And they chose the latter. And of course, nobody particularly wants to work at night. And so we were in a position of very strong leverage. And so we got a fantastic deal out of it. For modifying our working habits, we were exceptionally well paid for doing that. And I was aware at the time that revenge would be gotten at some point. And it started to ramp up over the successive years. Really an assault on the union, which was not like a militant, we're not about to man the barricades or anything like that. It was more of a professional association, but we had a certain amount of strength and a certain amount of power that needed to be eliminated, and they set about it little by little, including at one point the long-standing shop steward, who was an old guy who had been very efficient over the years, was retiring. Back then, you had to retire at a certain age, and ITV had a 60-year limit. You had to retire at the age of 60, not like today when you can work longer if you want or need to. So this guy hit 60 and retired. He had no choice. And the management put around this whisper that nobody should stand for election as shop steward, because if they do, we'll fire you within a week and you'll never work again in the industry. Just blatant intimidation. So there's just something in my head that if I hear a threat like that, I have to do it. So I thought, okay, I'll stand. So I entered my name. I was the only one. And a manager bumped into me in the corridor afterward and said, you know, you'll be gone in a week. And I said, well, we'll see about that. And that was my real kind of Jack Reacher moment. And that 1 week that I was threatened turned into about 120 weeks before they eventually got rid of me. So that was formative in my life. It was just one of those things, I will not put up with this. And so I was fighting for a couple of years, really. It was a desperate rearguard action. There were plenty of victories along the way in terms of battles, but we lost the war overall. And eventually, a bit over 2 years later, they did get rid of me. So it was a question of what to do next. And it was a tough decision. You know, I was nearly 40. My entire professional career was, I was hyper-trained and hyper-skilled at the one job that no longer existed. And I was never going to be allowed to work in the industry again to find a different role. So it felt pretty hopeless until I said, well, calm down, just wait a minute, take 2 steps back. What is it fundamentally that you were doing? And fundamentally what I was doing was understanding what the viewer wanted, knowing how the viewer would react. And so I thought, all right, that's the basic skill. Can I translate that to something else? And I did not want to work for anybody else. I didn't want to have a boss. I didn't want to interview for a position. I was just so fed up. I didn't want any of that stuff. So I thought I could write a book. Because all my life, if I've enjoyed something, I want to know how it's done. And so as I'd read all my life, I'd kind of tentatively tried to figure out, what are they doing? How are they doing it? Why are they doing it? And I think added to the desperation, it was the right time to try it. So I did try it. And happily it worked. If it hadn't worked, I don't know what I would have done.
A big feature of the show is that we love to get into the mechanics of how people got particularly their early books published. So how did it work for you in terms of getting representation and then for Killing Floor finding a publisher for it?
Yeah, well, first you get representation and then it's up to the agent to find the publisher. So I understood my main task was to find a good agent. And, I was, having worked in television, I was familiar with what we call the agented professions, but I'd never had one myself. And I was laboring slightly under a kind of dusty stereotype about publishing that, if you send something to somebody, it's months before they even open the envelope and reply. And I was in a rush, I had no money. I was literally running out of mortgage payments and all of that kind of thing. So it had to be done quick. So I wrote the first half of my first book and sent it to an agent that I'd picked out of the writer's handbook. He seemed like the right guy for me. I sent the first half and said, this is the first half of a book I've just finished, because I figured that by the time he opened the envelope and replied, I would have finished it. But this agent that I picked was super unusual because he will not be beaten simply by time. He will read everything the day it comes in. Not all of it, obviously. If he's not enjoying it, he'll dump it. But he will look at everything on the day. And so he immediately wrote back to me. And this is how long ago, not email, not a text, nothing. This was a letter. He wrote a letter back saying, I like this. Will you send me the second half? Which I hadn't yet written. So I said to him, well, I'm just making some adjustments to the end, and I'll send it to you as soon as possible. So I wrote the rest of it as fast as I could, sent it to him. He went through a couple of rounds of reactions and suggested revisions, and we perfected it, and then he sold it. And so, shamelessly, I have to say, I'm the author that was never rejected. I got the first agent that I applied to, and he got the first publisher that he submitted it to. Although that is slightly, it sort of sweeps under the carpet a strategy that we had. We were going to first sell it as a movie, and then hoping that with the movie sale it would make the book sale a little easier. But it didn't sell as a movie. And so we had to sell it cold as a book, which happily happened. And then, of course, literally the day the book was published, Hollywood bought it. It was as if they needed validation from somebody else.
How did you find the writing process for that first book? How long did it take you, and how did you arrive at the character of Jack Reacher? What was the inspiration that went into him?
Well, that's a great question about the inspiration. I mean, it took 5 months to write the first draft, from the very first word to the final completed version. And it was a joy. I loved it. I just loved sitting there making stuff up, inventing people, inventing situations. I knew it was going to work for me because I was enjoying it so much. I remember one night, my wife said, we should go to the supermarket tomorrow. There's a lot of stuff we need to get. And she's very tiny and she needs me to carry heavy stuff and so on. And I remember being annoyed, thinking, damn, I really wanted to write that next scene tomorrow, in exactly the way that you feel when you're reading a great book and you have to stop for some other reason. You feel frustrated, annoyed, a little upset about it. I felt the same thing about not being able to write the next morning. So I thought, yeah, this is going to work for me. But what I wrote was, I'd been in the entertainment world long enough to understand that you can never do it like a bullet point list. You can't make a list of imagined virtues that you've got to have. You know, if you start saying, okay, well, there's a lot of women readers aged 34 to 49. Now, what are they going to like? They need this. Other people need that. If you start doing it like that, you've got no chance at all, because it's just a cardboard product with all the spark and life beaten out of it. So I knew enough to know that you can't pre-decide anything. So I just had to sit there under tremendous pressure. You know, I was going broke. I had the money I had in the bank was running out. I was only a few months away from defaulting on my mortgage. This had to work. And so the pressure was great, but I had to ignore everything. I just had to say, shut your eyes, metaphorically, and write and see what comes out. And to me, that was crucial, that I ended up with a book that I liked 100%. I liked it. And if I like it, then obviously I'm a unique individual human, but not that unique. All of us are very similar to everybody else in many, many ways. So I figured if I like it, then other people are going to like it too. And the only open question there is how many? Is it going to be hundreds of other people, thousands, or millions? And that's the only thing you don't know. But you've got to get that initial product right. You've got to have it with a beating heart of its own. And the only way to do that is just to write what you want and hope for the best.
How then, after Killing Floor, did things accelerate in the years to come? And when did it become clear that the series and the character had real momentum behind it? And with that, with this decision that you made to move to the US in 1998, how did that fit in with what else was going on?
You know, people misremember my career in a lot of ways. They compress the chronology, that they think it was like an instant massive hit and it was plain sailing thereafter. And what they're actually doing there is compressing, 8 or 10 years at the beginning. Killing Floor, the first book, was a really solid genre hit. It created a lot of buzz inside the mystery and thriller community, and it won a couple of awards, and it did quite well within that community. And then the second book a little better, and the third book a little better. But it was a long, long haul. And I remember those early book tours for, the first, say, half dozen books. And I'd be flying every morning to the next city. And in the airport, I was completely invisible. None of my books were in the bookstores. I never saw anybody reading one. It felt like being published by the Witness Protection Program. And it was literally years before it migrated outward into the wider culture. I think it was 8 years before I got a number one. And it was probably 10 or 12 years before Reacher had an existence independent of the books, quoted in the wider culture. So people are really compressing a decade into an instant thing. And it was definitely not instant. And this is the difference between publishing then and publishing now, that they were clearly, self-evidently prepared to have an upfront investment that would last that long before it became massive. And now I think they don't have that horizon. It's got to be much, much quicker. So I'm glad I started when I did, but having said that, when I did start, there were loads of people saying, oh, I'm so glad I started in the 80s. And then there were even older guys saying, oh, I'm really glad I started in the 70s. From the author's perspective, I think the feeling is that publishing is always tough. And it is always tough. And it's possible to say it's getting worse now, but it's equally valid to say, no, it's just getting different now.
So was it a case of building slow momentum, or was there one moment or one book where things really exploded into the stratosphere for you?
I don't think there was one book that suddenly jumped ahead of the rest. It was pretty incremental. But I think that what happened for me was my career sort of more or less exactly coincided with the rise of the internet. I remember doing the final polishes on Killing Floor in the summer of 1995, and then getting the page proofs from the publisher and going through them and marking them up. And that exact week that I was doing that with Killing Floor, a little tiny online bookseller was starting up in Seattle called Amazon. And, literally that summer, I was nothing, they were nothing. And the Amazon grew and the internet gossip circuit grew. The way to get a hit basically in those days was that the genre stores would talk to each other literally on the phone. A genre store in New York would be on the phone with one in San Francisco talking about what have they read, what's new, what's hot. And then that was suddenly massively expanded into the internet situation where there's a constant exchange of information, where anything new is immediately known elsewhere. So I think, I can't prove it statistically, but I'm pretty sure that the rise of the internet and the rise of my career, is that causation or correlation? I don't really know, but it was a definite trend.
And just following up on my previous point, how had you ended up in the US? Where did that piece come from?
Well, that came from just a long-term fascination from me. I've always loved America, or the idea of America. When I was a little boy growing up in Birmingham, America was this distant rumor, a glamorous land of plenty with all these exciting things to do and exciting people. And so in the back of my mind, I always had the idea I should go to America. That's where I really belonged. And then at university in England, in Sheffield, I met an American woman. She was a student there, and she was from New York. And we fell in love, we got married, and I assumed that as soon as we graduated, we would go to America. But I should have gotten a clue, because why was she at university in England? It was because she was a rabid Anglophile, and she would not leave. It took a long time before she would contemplate leaving, by which time we'd had a daughter who was just coming up to the end of high school, and we thought, this was 1998. We thought, this is the year to move if we're ever going to. And our daughter said she was going to move anyway, whether we did or not. And so that's when we moved, and I felt great. I've got nothing against Britain at all. except that I think I'm one of those British people that has that wandering gene. You know, all over the world for the last couple of hundred years, you found Englishmen doing weird things here and there. There is some desire to explore and move on amongst some of us, and I clearly had that. And I like living in America. I'm not an American citizen. I've never applied for it because I also like not being a citizen of where I live. I like to be a permanent outsider, and I like to be stateless. You know, some years ago, Theresa May said, what was it? She said something like a citizen of...
Citizens of nowhere.
Yeah, citizens of... I like being a citizen of nowhere.
Could we talk now about Jack Reacher as a character? I was interested in some of your previous interviews. You talked about deliberately wanting to create a character that was not morally ambiguous. You wanted someone who was very clear on good and bad. And also I was interested to see that you didn't want to create a character arc for him. Could you explain a little bit about why you wanted to create a character in that vein?
Yeah, well, everything I've ever done is based on how I felt as a reader and how I still feel as a reader. And in terms of, you know, crime fiction and thrillers and so on, there's been a long trend to make the hero more and more miserable and more dysfunctional. And like all trends, it started out brilliantly. You know, you could maybe say James Lee Burke with Dave Robichaux, recovering alcoholic, vulnerable, you know, weak in certain ways. He was the prototype. And of course, the first time around, it's always magnificent. It's great. But then you get this kind of copycat effect that also inflates, so that next year somebody's writing a book where the guy is, you know, he's miserable, he's an alcoholic, and then the next guy, he's a divorced alcoholic whose daughter hates him, a divorced alcoholic whose daughter hates him and who accidentally shot a suspect in the dark, and it turned out to be a 12-year-old boy, so he has to go and live in the cabin in the woods with a metaphorical bullet lodged next to his heart. And my instinct as a reader was that people don't want to read about miserable people. People want to read about an alternative to reality. In other words, people that are strong and unbothered and capable. And so I thought, yeah, I want to go back to a much earlier time where the hero is uncomplicated, has no problems, and is strong and has a very well-defined moral compass. But the trick about that, how do you do that without making it boring and sanctimonious? So I just thought, you know, actually people do have pretty strong moral compasses. They know what is right and what is wrong, and they know what is fair and what is not fair. And so I thought to have a representative for them was important. So Reacher, yeah, he is uncomplicated. He's not boring because he's got a lot of weirdness about him. But the point is, he does not know that. He's not aware that he is as weird as he is. So he's not constantly gazing at his navel and bathing in self-pity. He just gets on with it. And the rest of us think, yeah, he's weird. But he has no self-pity element about him.
We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pictures. Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes. Another question that we always put to novelists on the podcast is about the construction of plot, and the terminology that we've acquired is whether you're a plotter or a plunger. So whether you're someone who has everything works out in advance, be that in post-it notes on the wall, or we've even heard of a spreadsheet on one occasion, or if you dive in and follow your nose. And we've heard both extremes and everything in the middle. Where do you sit on that spectrum?
Yeah, the version I heard is plotter or pantster for seat of the pants, and I'm definitely the latter. I mean, I literally have no idea what the next paragraph is going to be. I have no sense of the story worked out. I sometimes have either a visual image or possibly a line of dialogue that I know is going to come eventually. But I do it entirely by instinct. I write what I hope is a good first sentence, and then I scratch my head, light a cigarette, and think, all right, what would be a good second sentence? And then it's all the way through, probably about 11,000 sentences in a book, and every single one is unpredictable to me. I don't know what it's going to be. And to me, that is really the only way that I could do it, because basically I love story. I just love working out a narrative. And if I did that beforehand with the post-it notes, or God forbid a spreadsheet, then I have told myself the story. The story is done. I'm ready for the next story. And to go back and just type out an elongated version of what I've already figured out would be boring. And I think the boringness would show up as I went along, because my heart is no longer in it. I'm already thinking about the next thing. So yeah, for me, I'm a total chaotic pantster. And that has been the only difficulty with working with Andrew, is that he's a little more normal than I am. He likes to be able to see a tiny little bit further ahead. So we would, come up with a great scene, and I'd be very satisfied with it. And then he'd say, okay, what's next? And I would say, I have no idea, because I don't. You just got to feel it in the moment. And sometimes in some of the books, I remember one of them in particular, there was a woman character that I assumed was going to be probably an ally, or maybe even the love interest for Reacher. And about halfway, or 2/3 of the way through the book, she just turned into the bad person. And I had not planned that. I had no idea that was going to happen. And I remember in Killing Floor, for instance, I wrote a little scene where Reacher confiscates some sunglasses from a bad guy in the prison, just as a marker of dominance, really. And Reacher puts on the sunglasses and so on and so forth. And to me, that was just a little character scene that was nothing really. But then many pages later, I suddenly realized, wow, I can use that as one of the clues. And that's kind of how I work, is I just put stuff down out of instinct, and then later on, a lot of it seems useful.
Is that instinct then usually abided by? What's your editing process like?
Well, yeah, that's, again, people are going to hate me for answering this question, but I don't do any editing. I mean, having said that, I mean, we've got to go to the deep background of both answers, is that I have read all my life. I taught myself to read when I was 3, and I have never been without a book. That is now 65 years of constant reading, typically a book a day. And so when I say I have no idea what I'm doing in the plot, that's not true, really. I've read 100,000 plots, and they kind of imprint on your mind in a way that gives you a kind of internal spreadsheet, I suppose. You've got a sense of what works and what doesn't. So being a pantster is not really accurate. What you're doing is actually relying on what you already have experienced. What I do is I write, one day, and then at the beginning of the next session, I will read what I just wrote and smooth it out and change a word here and there, and then launch onward. And then the next day I'll reread that and smooth it out and launch onward. So it's always a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back process on a daily basis, which means that technically by the time I reach the end of the book, I've probably combed through every word 80 or 90 times. So that is then the first draft. And that is the only draft that I do. Because again, I have this I suppose, connected with being a spontaneous pantster. I have this kind of weird belief that is what happened. That is the story. And to go back and change it would be dishonest and manipulative. And often my editor will say, wouldn't it be better if this happened after that? And I will say, yeah, probably, but it didn't. It's as if it's a true story that I'm recording. So when I get to the end of the first draft, really there are, maybe in the editing process and copy editing process, there will be half a dozen words changed or something of that nature, but absolutely no significant changes.
Another of our perennial questions is about money and how it interacts with people's writing lives. So be as candid or as guarded as you're comfortable here. But with Reacher, when was it clear right at the beginning that you were going to be able to support yourself with this? And then when later on was it clear that you were going to make substantial money? And then how has that interacted with the creative process going forward?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't mind answering it at all. I mean, I had a 2-book deal for the first 2, and that was it was generous, really. Certainly perfectly adequate in terms of living for a couple of years. And then I got very lucky in that the London Book Fair was on, and my American publisher happened to be walking down Piccadilly, and she saw a rival American publisher walking toward her, holding my book. And she panicked that there was going to be a coup, that he wanted me to move to his publishing house, and she didn't want that to happen. So the deal for books 3 and 4 became very substantial. And at that point, I was living a life of luxury. And then it just got more and more insane. And then when the movies started and so on, that produced an enormous boost. And I think I remember 2016 was probably my best ever year. I just made an insane amount of money. I made $1.04 every second during 2016. And so that just catapulted me to a level that was inconceivable, from my expectations as a kid to a realistic assessment of how far I might get. It was just way in excess of that. I don't think it made any difference at all in terms of the creative process, because you're very aware that you're doing something for an audience. You're doing something for a reader. But the number of readers gets impersonal, I think is the best word, very, very quickly. Technically speaking, when you write your first book, nobody's read any of your books. Then maybe your mother reads it. And then and you've got to discount that as family loyalty. And then you imagine one person that you don't know has read your book. Then it becomes 2, then it becomes 20, then it becomes 200, then it becomes 2,000. And by the time you've got 2,000 readers, that's too many individuals to contemplate one at a time. If you had 2,000 readers and you wanted to take them each out to dinner to say thank you, it would take, if you went to dinner every night, it would take more than 5 years. And so, when you hit that sort of 2,000 level, I think it already becomes unapproachable to relate to an individual reader. So you're just always basically writing for yourself. And the money can't change that. It doesn't change that. Especially if, like me, you have been sure from the beginning that it is an inspirational thing. You've just got to write what you want. You can't do the laundry list thing. So your method of working is not changing. And your life doesn't really change, because the great thing about being a writer is you do it late. It's always, or at least almost always, a second phase career. All my friends and contemporaries who are successful have done something else before for half of a career, whatever it may be, journalist or whatever. They've done half their life as something else, and then they become a writer. And the point is that your personality is fixed by that point, your tastes are fixed, you don't change much as a person. I can totally see if you become a rock star or something at the age of 20, that is a different thing. But if you become a rich and successful writer at the age of 55, that is not going to change you much.
When we interviewed David Baldacci, another extraordinarily successful novelist, on the show, he talked about renegotiating his royalties and profit structure with his publishers. Was that something you've ever been tempted to do, or did you just trust that they were giving you a kind of fair shake on advances and things like that?
Yeah, I've never done that, and people do that. They leverage a higher royalty rate, or they leverage downward the percentage the agent takes, and so on and so forth. And I think that is disgraceful and sort of dishonorable. What I've always done, the basic structure of the first deal I got is what I've always stuck to, because this is a front-loaded business that the publisher and the agent and all the people around you invest at the beginning. They lose money at the beginning. And as I said earlier, in my case, that went on for many years. They were basically spending a lot and hoping. And then you do become successful. That's time for the publisher and the agent to recoup that early investment. It's not time for the author to start strong-arming extra profit out of it. So I've always kept on the same deal, the same royalty rate, and I just feel it would be, I don't know, somehow too self-centered and too entitled to start grabbing more.
The other fascinating discussion we've had with very commercially successful writers, so David Baldacci, but also Jeffrey Archer, is this relationship between so-called literary fiction and genre fiction, and how that plays out on both sides, and how there can be tension between those worlds. Has that been a thing for you, and what is your thought about that more generally?
I think it has been a thing, but only partially. That in as much as out of a matter of common sense, I think that it is backward to imagine if you write something that is going to appeal to a very small number of people, that is somehow harder than writing something that will appeal to a very large number of people. It just seems nuts to me to imagine that it's harder to write a literary novel, because a literary novel is in a whole different audience. It's a whole different category. If you've got a sophisticated readers who love reading, Martin Amis or Julian Barnes or whoever, first of all, those people are never going to be satisfied 100% with any book. They're very critical. And 90% is about as high as they can ever get. And if they start a book and are not enjoying it, they'll put it down and start the next one on a constant quest. But with a mass audience, if you give them a bad book, they may never read again. They may just go straight to video games or YouTube or whatever and just not bother with reading anymore. And so it is a lot harder to write for an audience of millions as opposed to thousands, because you've got to satisfy a wide range of tastes and reading abilities. So it frustrated me a lot that it was somehow regarded as easy, and you would get these phrases cranking out, as if you were just turning a handle like a sausage machine and out it was coming. It's not like that at all. It's very hard work. And but what I did notice was that it was only the second and third rate literary authors that got really uptight about it. The actual good ones, they're fine. They appreciate what I'm doing. I appreciate what they're doing. And in many cases, because we're thrown together in various industry contexts, we become friends and very much admire and respect each other for what we're doing.
You've talked about appealing to a broad spectrum of readers. The Reacher books in particular have a big female following. Was that an unexpected development, or did you always have a hunch that your sort of tall, brooding protagonist would appeal?
It has to be said that all fiction has a majority female audience. Whatever fiction it is, there are likely to be more women reading it than men. Men are so frustrating like that. I hate it. They are, especially the kind of AB1 male who is literate and can afford the book. They have this huge thing about fiction is somehow unworthy and they should really be spending their time and money on a biography of a dead president from 200 years ago. And I think you can even see, for instance, the huge success of the Da Vinci Code. Those numbers really were based on everybody reading that book, men included, and men were happy to do so because it said Da Vinci on the front, so it sounded like almost like a historical art history thing or something. And it became respectable for men to hold that book. And so that was why the sales were kind of double what they should have been. But for me, more women read my books because more women read any fiction, but I do think I do have more than my fair share of women readers, and they're certainly, I think, the most passionate fans. And that did surprise me a little bit because, as I said, I wrote that first book purely out of instinct. It was to satisfy only me. I was not going to make any compromises based on what I thought the market could bear. And I finished that book, I read it through, and I thought, oh my God, men are going to like this, but women are going to hate it. This guy's a filthy, dirty barbarian who never changes his clothes, and he's presumably dirty and smelly and all that kind of thing. But I was completely wrong. Women took to him hugely, and I've been fascinated as to why. Why the passion? And I remember years ago, I did a bookshop event in Arizona, where it was packed, about 120 people in the bookshop, and all of them were women, literally all of them. And at the beginning of the event, I said, look, I'm not going to do my normal event. I'm not going to tell you anything. You're going to tell me, why are you here? What is it that grabs you about the Reacher books? And we had the most fascinating conversation that was very illuminating in a lot of different ways. Women, even now, 2023, find it hard to express anger or a confrontational or oppositional attitude, even now. And so they love to see Reacher do that by proxy. And they love the fact that Reacher respects women. I mean, Reacher's pretty much indifferent to gender, that he will either be your friend or your enemy based on your character, not on your gender. He will help you or he will kill you based on what you deserve, not whether you're a man or a woman. They respected that. Ultimately, also, they found him sexy, as you say, the mysterious stranger. But crucially, what they loved was, allied with that feeling is that he never stays in the same place. And so he is the perfect, safe affair. You can have intense fun for 48 hours, and then he will be gone. He will never write, he will never call, he will never show up again. You will not be found out, therefore you will not have to get divorced, you will not lose your house and kids and all that kind of thing. He is the ultimate safe fantasy.
Could we talk about the adaptations of Reacher? So there have been these two iterations, the Tom Cruise films about a decade ago and more recently the Amazon series. Could you tell us again how that came about? And then is it correct that you had a clause in your contract with the films that was meant that after two of them you could discontinue them? Yeah,
that is correct. And I do not know how or why that clause got in there, because I don't remember asking for it, but it must have just been my lawyer who did it as a sort of safeguard thing. What happened initially was that the Reacher franchise, as I said, from day one in 1997 was always optioned by somebody, and it went through a kind of parade of misfortune, really. The first person to option it was Polygram Filmed Entertainment, and that division, it was a division of Seagram's liquor group, actually, for some bizarre reason, and that was reshuffled out of existence, and so that option lapsed. And then Sony Pictures bought it, and the executive who was behind it died, and so it became literally an orphan project. And then New Line Cinema bought it, and one just repeated year after year after year. And then in 2005, it was up for option again, and a consortium based on Paramount Pictures with investments by certain other people got the deal, and Cruise Wagner, which was Tom Cruise and Paula Wagner, their production company, was one of the investors. And that then sort of lingered in development for a long, long time, at least 5 years or more. And then finally a screenplay was written by Christopher McQuarrie, who had won an Oscar for The Usual Suspects screenplay. A really great guy, smart guy, great writer. He wrote an absolutely magnificent screenplay. And it was circulated amongst everybody, all the executive producers. And Tom Cruise, as one of the executive producers, received the script and read it. And it was such a great script that he wanted to be in it. And, that was a big decision for me, because obviously Tom Cruise physically was completely wrong for Reacher. But on the other hand, he's really the last global megastar. And so the promotional value was going to be gigantic in places that are difficult to affect otherwise. Brazil, Indonesia, China. How do you effectively promote there? But let the movie do it for you. So it was a double-edged decision for me. I knew it would be trouble for me that people would complain about Cruise, but I knew it would be fantastic. The movie was going to be great because the screenplay was so great, and the promotional value was incalculable. And that first movie was based on One Shot, was the book title. And the working title all the way through was One Shot. And then, of course, Hollywood does extensive testing, and that title was found to be not all that attractive. So I remember getting a call saying, would you mind if we retitled it Jack Reacher? And I thought, let me think about that for a split second. Would I mind somebody spending $150 million promoting my brand around the world? Yes, go right ahead. And so in a lot of ways, the movie for me was, the first movie in particular I thought was excellent as a kind of the sort of B movie you'd love to watch on a plane, really solid. But it was a thing about balancing disapproval from my readers against publicity around the world. On the other hand, then, I thought the second movie was not so great. It was sort of blander and much more conventional. So that clause then kicked in, would there be a third movie? And in the meantime, of course, Netflix had established itself. Amazon was entering the streaming market. They were offering great inducements to do it. And I just instinctively thought, yeah, great, streaming is definitely the way to go. And crucially, the difference between television and movies is the star in the movies is 100% responsible for bringing the money. The star has got to attract the investment. Television works differently. The star doesn't matter. It could be a completely unknown person because we're not depending on their identity to provide the investment. And that gave us so much more latitude in who we cast. And as I said before, the running time meant that we could have all the light and shade, and all the good bits from the book would not have to be cut out. And so that was a no-brainer, and I think really, really successful. I loved that first season.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so as a final question from me, your next book with your brother is out in October, The Secret. How many more co-authored books are coming? Because it's meant to be a sort of handover period, right? So yeah, when are you going to hang up your boots or put down your pen or whatever horrible metaphor you'd like?
Well, this is it. Yeah, The Secret is the fourth of four transitional. The handover period is now complete. And so the next one will be all Andrews. The Secret was mostly Andrews, to be honest. I mean, we had two discussions at the beginning. One, that it would be a prequel, Reacher back in the army, which once in a while is fun to do. And then we were just kicking ideas around. And at the time, I don't know if you remember this, but there were a lot of news reports about Russian oligarchs mysteriously falling out of hotel windows from a high floor. And we just thought, that is irresistible. That image is irresistible. And so we thought, all right, we'll build in somehow the fact that lots of people are mysteriously dying in accidents, and we'll see if we can make that relate to some kind of Department of Defense issue. So yeah, The Secret was fun to do, even though I've been gradually getting more hands-off. And as I say, next year I'll be completely hands-off. I'll be retired and I'll be reading, which is the only frustration about being a writer, that all those hours that you're writing a book, you're not reading somebody else's. And that's still my greatest pleasure in life, just to have a blank day, a comfortable sofa, and a great book.
And as a final question from me, what has the response been like from the fans and from the kind of review establishment during this transitional period? I saw that with The Sentinel, there was some pushback. How has it been sort of since then, and how do you feel about that?
Well, The Sentinel had a specific purpose that, as well as being the first of the collaborations, I wanted Andrew to help me drag Reacher slightly into the present day in terms of technology, because I'm completely hopeless with technology, and I've always portrayed Reacher as a Luddite in that sense. And in a way that's appealing, because I think readers generally like the hero to be a little bit behind the curve, because it doesn't humiliate the reader that they don't know everything that they should know. It makes them more comfortable with the whole situation. So Reacher being a little old-fashioned about technology was good, but over the 25 years I was doing it, he just got ludicrously behind the times. And so I needed Andrew who being 15 years younger than me, totally different generation in terms of relations to technology. I wanted him to just nudge Reacher a little bit into the future with that. So The Sentinel was about servers and so on, and computers, and Reacher had a cell phone to use and things like that. That was deliberate as a way of nudging him into the future. The other thing that came from Andrew, which was that obviously he's read every book as it came out, or even before, I'd send in the manuscript and he'd read it. And he remembered in the earlier books, and I wasn't really aware of this, but in the earlier books, Reacher talked more. He was funny and sardonic and sarcastic, and he was capable of talking in whole paragraphs. For some reason, over the years, I was getting more and more brief and clipped about Reacher, to the point where a 3-word answer was usual, and a sort of 7-word explanation was more or less a filibuster. I was getting manic about the concision of it. And Andrew said, no, let's go back to how it used to be a little bit and have him, speak in whole paragraphs. And so The Sentinel was a sort of noticeable change, I think. Plus, on top of that, everybody who loves a book series is so possessive of it. They don't want anything messing with it. They don't want any changes. And so there was a lot of apprehension and even hostility, I think, amongst certain readers. But in general, I think it worked pretty seamlessly. The reviews have been, they've examined it very closely, but most of them have said, yeah, this is fine. And so for the vast majority of readers, and this is something that I had hoped for from the very beginning, that it was not going to be about me, it was not going to be about author, it was going to be about the character. It was about Jack Reacher. That's all they wanted. And in a lot of ways that worked. The guy that was the accountant at my agent's firm was once in a W.H. Smith queuing up behind an old lady who was buying the new Jack Reacher paperback. And he couldn't help himself. He sort of nudged her and said, I work for the agent that represents that author. And she said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I work for a guy who represents Lee Child. He's his literary agent. And she said, I don't understand. And she said, well, Lee Child writes these books. And she said, no. These are Jack Reacher books. And he said, yeah, but Lee Child writes them. And she said, what? You mean Jack tells him the story and he writes it down? You know, the character lives, and that's all I wanted, and therefore the author doesn't really matter. And that seems to be what Andrew and I have gotten away with.
I like that you tell that in a heartening story rather than a reflection of that woman's slightly troubled mental state.
Well, you can't beat that reaction. You know, it shows that it's working, that these are Reacher books. And yeah, even in terms of detail, you know, like early on, we would be trying to make the publisher put Jack Reacher bigger than any other word on the cover. You know, a Jack Reacher novel. It took years for publishers to accept that would be a good idea.
We've got to draw an end to things now because we've overrun, but it's been a great pleasure to have you on the show. I'm wishing both you and Andrew all the best, and Jack as a standalone personage with everything going forward.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks, Rachel.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Lee Child. His latest book, co-authored with his brother Andrew, is called The Secret and will be published in October by Bantam. He's on Twitter at LeeChildReacher and on Instagram at JackReacherBooks. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Lee?
I thought it was a really enjoyable and wide-ranging conversation. And if his honesty about how much he earned in 2016 had you reaching for a calculator, you are not the only one. I thought it was particularly interesting hearing about his experience of television and how that shaped his understanding of narrative. It made me think of our interview with Ruth Ozeki a couple of years ago. And I thought it was interesting as well that he doesn't renegotiate deals with publishers with regards to royalties and things. He sort of accepts it on its own terms. Given the sort of heft he has, he very much could have done that. How about you?
Well, exactly that on the contract point is what I was thinking. And yeah, like a lot of people, I was trying to dive a little bit more into what those figures meant in terms of how much he was making annually. But what I think is interesting is I remember when we had David Baldacci on the podcast, and he said that his renegotiation, if he hadn't done it, he'd have left hundreds of millions of dollars on the table. And I think we worked out roughly that Lee Child was making about $30 million a year at his best year. So, I mean, I think potentially he needs to go and talk to David Baldacci to get his contracts rewritten was my thought. But, you know, maybe once you're at that level, these things are less important.
It's just serious on a page.
Yeah. Exactly. I thought it was a really interesting interview, and someone we've been trying to get on the show for a while, obviously a kind of huge name, who also has a reputation in the industry of being kind of gracious and helping out other writers. I've heard he's very open to writing endorsements to other emerging crime writers. I was also fascinated by diving into Reacher's female fan base, including the people who think that he's real, which I thought, you know, was a phenomenon that deserves further explanation. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to?
Just one further note on the interview. I liked his aphorism that there are only two kinds of books, ones you can't put down and ones you can. I thought that was very true in lots of ways. Things I've been up to. I have been redrafting a piece about Hollywood that has been rumbling on for a while, so I hope to get that away soon. And I'm about to go on holiday, so I've accrued a huge list of books and I can't wait to get through them. I visited our friend Tom Rowley's bookshop recently. I picked up a novel there called Night Bitch by an American writer called Rachel Yoder. I have a non-fiction book called Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies by a woman called Elizabeth Winkler, who used to work at The Economist. I'm going to read James Ellroy's forthcoming novel. Anyway, I could be here all day. I hope to read a lot in my week off. How about you?
Are you taking hard copies or are you taking digital variants thereof?
I'm a hard copy evangelist at the expense of my spine.
And your baggage allowance, Rachel.
Yep. I just cram it all in my hand luggage. What have you been up to and what have you been consuming? Consuming
culturally. I had a very pleasant weekend rock climbing in the Wye Valley in Wales, which was sort of partly connected to my new book in that I have to improve my rope skills, but that was really fun. And then in matters cultural, I've been reading a book called Cher Ella by a Swiss woman, I think she's Swiss, maybe French, called Anne Derrière, which is again as part of my kind of investigation into Ella Meyer, this fascinating Swiss travel writer who I'm writing about in my new book. But Anne Derrière looked after her in her last years, and given she died at the age of 97, she basically spent 2 years looking after a non-Hungarian Ella Meyer, and then wrote a memoir about that, which is fascinating, if quite strange as well. And then in magazine land, I did my usual thing of trying to read two big pieces. So I read a piece in the New York Times magazine by a woman, I think I pronounced this right, called Dashka Slater, which is an adaptation of a book, but is about this Instagram scandal at a kind of affluent American West Coast high school, I think in 2017. I won't give too many spoilers, but basically there's no one ends up coming out of this story well, like the perpetrators, the people who try and do the response, the school administrators. And it's a kind of, it read, at least to me, as a sort of very powerful parable of the social media age. And then I read a New Yorker piece by Zach, I think it's Helfand, who is an editor there, but he wrote a piece about the cult or the subculture of monster trucks in the US, which is a really joyful piece of writing, particularly if you have any interest in matters automotive or things like that. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.